There are moments a man carries his whole life long, not because they were loud or grand, but because everything before them led up to that one still point, and everything after flowed down from it like water finding its level. I have lived past 70 years now, and I have known hard winters and dry summers and grief enough to fill a grain silo. But when I am asked what changed the course of my days, I always find myself returning to that autumn in Colorado, 1884, to a woman lying pale and burning in an upstairs room, and to a piece of fruit that no one in that valley had ever seen before. You must understand the kind of man he was before you can understand what he did. He had come over from the old country, from a warm, rocky coast where the lemons grew heavy on the trees and the sea air tasted of salt and brine. He had crossed the ocean with $63 sewn into the lining of his coat and a name nobody in Denver could pronounce without flinching. He had worked the rail yards first, then a sawmill, then a stretch of honest but thankless labor that took him across half of Colorado before the posted notice outside a dry goods store in the town of Hale Crossing caught his eye. Seeking a capable man of sober habits, ranch work, fair wages, inquire at the Vale property, 2 miles east on the wagon road. He had not intended to marry. Neither, by all accounts, had she. She was the widow of a successful rancher, a composed, handsome woman of 38 who had managed the Vale spread for 2 years on her own after her first husband died of a riding accident, and who had managed it well enough to earn the quiet respect of every rancher in the county and the quiet jealousy of several more. She hired men to work her land and kept them at a professional distance. She attended church, hosted the school teacher for supper twice a month, and did not entertain foolishness of any kind. The marriage had been arranged through a broker in Denver, which was not uncommon in those years. Practical arrangements for practical people. She needed a foreman she could trust with the property. He needed standing in the community, the kind a single immigrant laborer without connections rarely earned by himself. They had met twice before the ceremony. Both times she had studied him the way a woman studies a horse before she commits to purchasing it, measuring, reserving judgment. He had not minded. He understood what he was to her at the beginning. But he had not come all this way to remain a transaction. He had been on the Vale property for 3 months when the fever took her, a slow, creeping sickness that started as a cough and climbed into something far more frightening over the course of a week. By the time the doctor rode out from Hale Crossing, her temperature had risen so high that the household was speaking in low voices, and her sister had already sent for the preacher. The doctor's name was Harwell, and he was a man who wore his certainty the way other men wear fine coats, visibly, proudly, and as protection against the cold. He had practiced medicine in the territory for 11 years, and in that time, he had developed strong opinions about what worked and what did not, about who understood illness and who did not, and, though he would not have said so plainly, about which men were worth listening to and which were not. He had bled her twice. He had administered a tincture of quinine and another preparation he kept in a brown bottle and did not name aloud. He had ordered cold compresses changed every quarter hour and instructed the household to keep the room dark. None of it had turned the fever. It climbed anyway, steady and indifferent, the way floodwater climbs a fence post, slowly, then all at once. The husband had sat at the edge of the room through most of this, watching. He asked the doctor questions in his careful, accented English, questions that were precise and unhurried, and the doctor answered them with the particular patience a man reserves for those he has already dismissed. He was not a violent man, Harwell, and not a cruel one. He simply did not consider that the questions were worth much. On the third night, when her breathing had grown shallow and her sister had retired to the hallway to weep quietly against the wallpaper, he left the room without explanation. The ranch hand who had been keeping watch in the corridor heard him go down the stairs and out to the cold cellar, the small stone room dug into the hillside behind the house where provisions were stored through winter. He was gone perhaps 20 minutes. He returned carrying something wrapped in a cloth, something he had packed in straw and kept preserved through weeks of hard travel. A fruit, small and round and impossibly bright, the color of a lit coal with a thin rind and a scent that did not belong to Wyoming in February. It was the kind of fruit grown in warmer places, places most people in Hale Crossing had never seen and could not have named on a map. His mother had pressed 2 of them into his hands before he boarded the ship. She had said something to him in their language that, translated loosely, meant, "These are for the moment when ordinary things are not enough." He had carried them across an ocean and a continent in 3 months of frontier winter, not knowing what moment she meant. He thought, standing in the doorway of the sick room with the fruit in his hands and the lamplight falling across his wife's gray face, that he knew now. The doctor saw what he was carrying and stood up from his chair. The sister, who had followed him back inside, made a sound. He did not look at either of them. He looked at her, at the woman in the bed, at the shallow rise and fall of her chest. And he crossed the room and sat down beside her and waited for her eyes to open. Her eyes did not open right away. He sat in the chair the doctor had vacated and held the fruit in both hands, the way a man holds something he is not ready to put down. The warmth from the lamp reached him on one side. On the other side, the window rattled in its frame, and the wind off the high plain pressed against the glass, as though curious about what was happening inside. February in Wyoming had no patience for warmth of any kind. But inside the sick room, very quietly, he waited. The doctor had not sat back down. He stood near the foot of the bed with his black bag open, and he did not speak, but his silence had a quality to it, the quality of a man constructing an argument he intended to deliver the moment an opportunity presented itself. The sister stood in the doorway behind him, one hand resting against the frame. Neither of them spoke. Perhaps they were both waiting, as he was, for her eyes to open. When they did, they opened slowly and without full recognition. She looked at the ceiling first, then at the lamp, then, by degrees, at him. He leaned forward. He held the fruit where she could see it, small, round, its skin the color of a winter sunrise, yellow edging into something almost orange. And he kept his face very still, the way a man keeps his face still when he is trying to speak without words. He had been in this country long enough to know that what he was about to say would not translate well into speech. Not with the doctor standing there, not with the sister watching from the doorway, not with the whole house arranged against him. So he did not speak. He looked at her, at the woman who had agreed to marry a man she had never met, who had built and held this ranch by the force of her own will for longer than most people would have endured, who had signed her name to a letter and sent it across the country and waited. and he let her see his face plainly, without arrangement or concealment. Whatever she saw there, she did not look away from it. The doctor stepped around the side of the bed. He began to say something about the inadvisability, about her weakened state, about things he could not identify and therefore could not sanction. But the words fell away at the edges of the moment like snow falling into a river, absorbed and gone. Because she had lifted one hand from the quilt. It was a small gesture, uncertain, her fingers not fully steady. But she had lifted it and extended it, not toward the doctor, not toward the sister still watching from the door, but toward him. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He set the fruit carefully in her palm and felt her fingers close around it, slowly, as though she were testing the weight of something she had not yet decided whether to trust. The doctor drew a sharp breath. The doctor's breath hung in the cold air of the room, like a word that had not yet been spoken. He did not move, not toward her, not away. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched her fingers wrap around the small, bright thing he had carried all that way, and he felt something he could not have named in any language he knew, not in the English he had learned on the ship or in the tongue he had learned from his mother's kitchen. It was not hope exactly. Hope was a thing you held at a distance, like a candle in another man's window. This was closer than that. This was the moment before you knew. The sister in the doorway said something low and urgent, the kind of sound that comes from a person who has already decided that what is happening is wrong and is searching for the words to prove it. The doctor found his voice then, or part of it. He said there were protocols. He said the body in a fever state was compromised, was delicate, was not a place for experiment. He said the word experiment twice, as though repetition might add weight to it. She did not look at him. She was looking at the fruit in her palm with the particular attention of a woman who has spent her life making decisions in conditions of imperfect information. He had seen that look before, not on her face, but on the faces of men who stood at crossroads in bad weather and chose a direction and walked. A look that was not certainty. A look that was something better than certainty, because it had room in it for doubt and chose forward anyway. She turned the fruit slowly in her hand. The lamp on the nightstand threw a thin gold light across her fingers, across the smooth skin of it, across the small, bright, improbable thing that did not belong here and yet was here. Her breathing was shallow. The fever still lived in her face, in the high color of her cheeks, in the faint trembling at the corners of her mouth. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say something that would make it easier, some explanation, some account of where this had come from and why he believed what he believed. But the room was so quiet that any word would have landed like a stone in still water, and he was afraid, not of the doctor, not of the sister, but of disturbing whatever it was that she was working through inside herself. The doctor stepped forward, one step, deliberate, reaching out his hand with the flat authority of a man who has been obeyed in enough rooms to expect obedience. She raised her eyes, not to the doctor, to him. And in that look, in the particular steadiness of it, in what was not in it, which was fear, which was apology, which was the habit of deferring to louder voices, he understood something he had not been certain of until that moment. She was going to take a bite. She raised the piece of fruit to her lips. He had cut it carefully. the way his mother had shown him, the way her mother had shown her, back in a place none of these people in this room would ever see. Not a reckless slice, not a careless one. He had found the grain of it, split it along its natural line, and the flesh had opened like something that had been waiting to be opened. The color of it was wrong by every measure this territory knew, too bright, too foreign. The smell of it was sharp and alive in a sick room that had only known camphor and waiting. The doctor's hand closed on the bedpost, not reaching any more, just gripping, as though the furniture might steady the moment for him. Her sister made a sound, not a word. The kind of sound a person makes when a word has not yet formed, but the feeling has already arrived, raw and shapeless, somewhere between a protest and a prayer. She did not look at either of them. She looked at him, and she put the fruit to her lips, and she took a small bite. He did not breathe. The room did not breathe. The juice ran along the edge of her lip. She pressed it in with the back of her wrist, a gesture so ordinary, so unconsciously herself, that something tightened in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. She was still there, still her, still choosing. She swallowed. Then she lay back against the pillow and she closed her eyes, and the room seemed to exhale all at once. Though not in relief, not yet, because no one in that room except him understood what he was hoping for, or why he was hoping for it, or whether hoping was a reasonable thing to be doing. The doctor spoke. He said the words a doctor says when he has been made irrelevant in his own professional capacity. He said them with dignity, which is the only way a man can say such things and still be a doctor afterward. He said that whatever happened next, whatever the outcome, he would hold no responsibility for it. He said this to the sister, which was the right audience, and he said it quietly, which was the correct volume, and he straightened his coat and he did not leave. That was the thing. He did not leave. A man who believed something terrible was about to happen would have left. He stayed near the window, his bag at his side, his arms folded, watching. That watching meant something. He chose to believe it meant something, anyway. He stored it away in the place where a man stores the things he cannot know yet, but needs to keep hold of. She slept. Not the restless, twisting kind of sleep the fever made, not the sleep of a body fighting. Something quieter. He sat in the chair beside her and he listened to the sound of her breathing, and the room grew dark around them both. And outside the window, the wind moved through the yard, and the night came in the way it does on the plains, slowly, then all at once. He woke before she did. The lamp had burned low in the night, and the room held that particular gray that comes in the hour before sunrise, when the darkness is spent, but the light has not yet committed itself. He had slept in the chair, upright, the way a man sleeps who is not certain he has earned the right to rest fully. His neck ached. He did not mind it. She was still. Not the stillness of before, which had been a terrible thing. A stillness that felt borrowed, temporary, like a fire that has gone quiet because it has run out of wood. This was different. This was the stillness of a body that had set down something heavy and had not yet remembered it needed to pick it back up. He leaned forward in the chair and he looked at her face. The color had changed, not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories, where a woman near death opens her eyes and speaks perfectly and asks for breakfast. It was subtle, a shift in the skin, the way the land shifts in early March when the thaw has not yet come. But something underground has decided. The gray had withdrawn from her cheeks. What remained was still pale, but it was a human pale, not the other kind. He reached out and placed the back of his hand against her forehead. Warm, still warm. But the heat had gone out of it. The burning, the terrible dry burning that had frightened him more than he had allowed anyone to see, that was diminished. He held his hand there longer than was necessary, because he needed to be certain, and because the certainty, when it came, was the finest thing he had felt in a long while. He stood carefully, so as not to wake her, and crossed to the window. The yard below was empty in the early light. The barn stood as it always stood. The fence posts ran their line toward the eastern pasture. Frost on the ground, thin and silver, the kind that would vanish an hour after the sun cleared the hills. Ordinary. All of it ordinary. And he was grateful for the ordinariness of it in a way he had not expected. He heard a sound behind him. Not her voice. A footstep in the hall. Someone had been awake in the house, or had risen early, or had perhaps not slept at all. The door did not open, but he could feel the presence on the other side of it. Standing, listening, waiting. He turned back toward her. Her eyelids moved. A small thing. The kind of movement a person makes when sleep is letting them go, releasing them back to the world by degrees. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. He pulled the chair a little closer and sat down, and he folded his hands in his lap, and he waited. He was good at waiting. It was, perhaps, the first skill a man in his position learned. You waited for the land to answer. You waited for the season to turn. You waited for the person in front of you to decide what they thought of you. You waited. The door opened. Not slowly, the way a person opens a door when they are uncertain. Quickly, the way a person opens a door when they have made up their mind about something and want the room to know it before they have said a single word. He rose from the chair. He did not step back from the bed, but he rose, which was the right thing to do. The doctor came in first. Then the older woman, her mother, he had gathered, who had arrived 2 days before with a carpet bag and a face full of judgments she had not yet finished delivering. Behind her, the housekeeper holding a lamp, though there was already enough morning light coming through the window to see by. They arranged themselves near the door the way people arrange themselves when they believe a confrontation is necessary. The doctor looked at the woman in the bed. He looked at her for a long moment, and his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not the kind of shift a man shows when he intends for others to see it, but the small, involuntary kind. He set down his bag and moved to the bedside and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, and when he took his hand away, he stood very still. The older woman said something sharp. He did not answer her, and she said it again, louder this time, with his name in it, the name they had given him here, the name that still sat a little unevenly in his ear, like a boot that had not yet been broken in. He looked at her steadily. He did not argue. He had learned that arguing accomplished very little in rooms like this one, with people like this, in moments like this. What a man said with his voice could be dismissed. What the world said on his behalf was harder to dismiss. And the world, at this particular moment, was saying something. The woman in the bed was breathing evenly. The fever that had held her for 4 days like a fist was gone from her face. He could see it simply by looking at her, the color returning, the stillness of real sleep rather than the restless unconscious of a body fighting something it was losing ground against. The doctor turned to him, not warmly, not yet, and perhaps not ever, and he did not require it. But the man turned, and he looked at him directly, and there was something in that look that was different from any look he had received in this house since he had walked through its front door. Not gratitude. It was too early, and the man was too proud for gratitude. But acknowledgement. The particular acknowledgement of a professional who has encountered something he cannot explain away. The older woman was not finished. She said 3 more things, each one a little harder than the last, and on the third one her voice cracked slightly, because she was frightened. He understood that now, and fear in a frightened person often comes out sounding like fury. He waited for the room to quiet. It took a while. The morning light continued its slow arrival across the floor, and he waited. When the room finally quieted, it was the doctor who spoke first, and what he said was careful. He said he could not account for the mechanism. He said he would not pretend otherwise. He said he intended to examine her again within the hour, and that if she continued on the trajectory she appeared to be on, he would want to know more about what she had been given, and from where it had come, and in what quantity. He answered each question plainly. The fruit, the name of it, which the doctor wrote down in a small leather-covered book he produced from his coat, the region it came from, the way it had been described to him years ago by an old woman in the village where he had grown up, who kept 2 of the trees in pots inside her kitchen through the winter and set them out in summer and guarded them with the particular ferocity of someone who understood their value. The doctor wrote. He did not look up while writing. When he finished, he pressed his lips together and nodded once, briefly, and then moved to the bedside and began his examination. The older woman watched all of this from the doorway. She had not left. He had not expected her to. She was the kind of woman who did not retreat from a room she felt she had a right to occupy, and she had every right to this one. He had never disputed that. What had passed between them was not a matter of rights. It was a matter of something older and harder to name. He stood near the window while the doctor worked. The light was full now, clear winter light that came flat and bright across the frost on the glass and lay in pale squares on the floor. He watched the woman in the bed. Her breathing was slow and even. Her hands, which had been curled tight against her chest through the worst of the night, lay open now at her sides. That was the thing he kept returning to. The hands. He had learned, in the months they had been in this house together, in the strange and halting education that is any marriage finding its shape, that she held things in her hands when she was frightened. A blanket edge, a bedpost. His sleeve once, during a storm that took part of the roof from the barn, though she had released it the moment she caught herself doing it. The open hands meant something. They meant the body had stopped bracing. The doctor finished and turned. He said her temperature had fallen. He said it measurably, as if precision were a form of protection against what he was being forced to admit. He said he would return in the afternoon. He left without further ceremony. The older woman remained. He did not move from the window. He was not certain what she intended, and he had learned that it was better, with her, to be still. She stood near the foot of the bed for a long moment, looking at her daughter the way a person looks at something they have come close to losing and are still not entirely certain they have kept. He watched her from the window. The morning light had shifted, growing softer now as a thin cloud moved across it, and the room was quiet in the way. Rooms are quiet after a long and difficult night. Not peaceful exactly, but emptied of its worst fear. Then she spoke. She did not look at him when she said it. She kept her eyes on the woman in the bed. She said that she had not slept. She said she had sat in the chair by the hall door most of the night, listening, and that she had heard him moving, back and forth, quietly, not pacing but checking, the way a man checks on something he is responsible for. She said she had expected, at some point, to hear silence. The kind of silence that means a person has given up and gone to sleep and left the matter to God or to chance. But the silence never came. He did not answer. She turned then, and she looked at him directly, the way she very rarely did. There was something in her face that he had not seen there before. It was not softness, exactly. She was not a soft woman, and he did not think she would ever be one, and he would not have known what to do with it if she were. It was something more considered than softness, something that had been examined before being offered. She said that she had been wrong about him. She said it plainly, without ornament, the way a person of her character would say a thing that cost her something. Not as an apology, as a correction of the record. She had made an assessment, she said, and the assessment had been wrong. And she was saying so now because she believed that a person who has made an error has an obligation to name it. He looked at her. He thought about the many things he might say. He had spent a considerable portion of his life in places where he had no words at all, where the language around him moved like water around a stone, touching him on all sides but never quite entering. And in those years he had learned to be careful with the words he did possess, to use them only when they would carry their weight. He told her that he understood what it was to make an assessment on incomplete information. He told her that he had not always been easy to assess correctly. She held his gaze a moment longer than he expected. Then she looked back at her daughter, and her daughter's hands still lay open, and the room held them both in its careful morning quiet. That morning passed without ceremony, which seemed right. Ceremony would have asked too much of all of them, required a kind of performance that the room was too tired for and too honest. Instead, there was tea brought on a tray. There was the sound of the cattle moving in the far pasture, the way they always did when the air was cool and the grass still carried its dew. There was his wife sitting up against the pillows, eating a small piece of bread with more appetite than she'd shown in a week. And the color in her face was not the color of fever, but the color of a woman who has come back from somewhere and is glad to find the world still waiting. He sat in the chair beside her, not speaking much, just present in the way that he had learned was sometimes more useful than speaking. She reached across once and set her hand over his, and he turned his hand palm up without thinking, the way you cup your hand beneath something you're afraid of dropping. The doctor came again that afternoon. He examined her with the careful economy of a man who is both relieved and puzzled. A man whose confidence has been tested by something he cannot fully explain and who has decided in the interest of his patient's welfare not to argue with the result. He said she was improving. He said she would need rest. He did not say anything further about the fruit, or the evening before, or the moment in the doorway when he had reached out his arm to stop what could not be stopped. Some things, he seemed to have decided, were better left to settle on their own. The servants were kind in the way that people are kind when they have witnessed something they did not expect to witness and are still quietly rearranging their understanding of the world. There was no discussion of it, only small attentions. Extra wood laid by the fire, a soup brought without being asked, a window latch tightened that had been loose for months. He stepped outside near evening. The ranch lay long and still in the cooling light, the hills going amber at their edges, the sky the particular shade of blue that comes only at that hour, only in that season, only in country that is too large to be hurried. He had crossed an ocean to reach a land like this. He had worked with his hands and his back and the slow accumulation of days, and somewhere in that accumulation, a life had taken shape that he had not known to wish for when he was young enough to wish. He heard the door behind him open. He did not turn. He heard her footsteps, slow and careful but steady. She came and stood beside him, and they looked out together at the light falling across the land that was theirs. She did not say anything. Neither did he. It was enough